So I called this 50 years of preserving and sharing Victorian architecture. Sharing is a kind of strange verb to stick in there. It's not like we're giving each other Victorian buildings. But a big part of what we do, I think, is to get people to appreciate the place that they live in, especially people who grew up in San Francisco. A lot of them sort of take for granted the beauty of this place. And I think today in the world of preservation, with a third of the White House being demolished in this last week, I hope that people are getting more and more aware that these things that we see around us, that we value, that give us a sense of culture and belonging, are not to be taken for granted. So that's kind of what we try to do, is not only preserve buildings and preserve other things, but also just sort of share the idea that it's worth doing. So San Francisco Heritage, you got that great introduction of what we do. We are the preservation group in San Francisco. We don't just deal with architecture, but we also focus on legacy businesses and cultural districts. San Francisco is a very diverse and interesting place of people. And we want to try to figure out, and this is an ongoing challenge, of how to keep like our Japantown feeling Japanese and supporting organizations, groups, and restaurants in Japantown while we're trying to preserve Victorian architecture and beautiful buildings and landscapes. So the other thing I think that when I try to talk about preservation with people is, and this is with policymakers, mayors, people in the state legislature, they think of preservation as some grand house that some very rich and powerful person built that is beautiful. And we definitely want to preserve those. But little places like this is a shipwright's cottage that we helped preserve in the Bayview area. And it's a vernacular house. It's got a little carpenter Gothic barge board there. It's not very complicated, but it is very representative of the industry, the shipbuilding industry that was down in Bayview. And so just by keeping it going, it's part of like giving the people, especially a lot of the new people who moved to that neighborhood, a sense of what the history is that they're a part of. Now this is part of a park and Indian Basin, and it's really a success story. And then we have something a little grander. This is our own Haas Lilienthal house. This was given to the organization in 1973 by the Haas Lilienthal family. We do public tours. We're going to have some on Saturday. I don't know what the conference schedule is, but you're welcome to come by and see the inside of it. We have school field trips, and it's a way to teach third graders about the past and visitors to get really their only chance to get into a Victorian house in San Francisco. It's open to the public. We're pretty well known here for that. As you might have seen by the initial slide here as I walked in, the Painted Ladies, very famous, mostly because of their location, but they're also beautiful buildings. And San Francisco, because it was so close to these large redwood forests, it was a great place for Victorian architecture, for this gingerbread, to really kind of go crazy, especially in the Queen Anne period of the Victorian era, with tiles, shingles, spindles, brackets, any kind of, I don't know, anything you can turn into a shape, they were going to plaster it onto a building. So a lot of this we have lost, as we'll talk about, and it was not always appreciated. So in 1939, the WPA had guidebooks that were created for every state in the United States. And just to give you a sense of how Victorian architecture was viewed in the 1930s, wealth meant even larger buildings with more and more architectural elements. An epidemic of the Victorian pestilence in aggregated form seized California. The results were lamentable and are obvious enough in all the older towns and cities of California. This is the Mark Hopkins mansion, which was across the street from where we are sitting here. The cable car goes by right there where the Mark Hopkins Hotel is. That was the Mark Hopkins mansion. Not to be emulated, as this writer said. So, but they have, they're trying to have a positive spin on it. In San Francisco, thousands of Victorian horrors were destroyed in the earthquake of 1906. But, and he didn't put sadly, but sadly, many remain. Their lines sometimes a little softened by shrubs and vines, sometimes stark and bare in their shabby decay. This is the William Westerfeld House, which is on the corner of Fulton and, let's see, that would be Steiner? Close there. Thank you, Scott, up the hill. Near Alamo Square, near those painted ladies. It has been restored by a gentleman named Jim Siegel. It's a beautiful house now. But you can see this is sort of how Victorians were valued in mid-century America. So as they mentioned, the writer mentioned, we had a big earthquake and fire which destroyed whole swaths of San Francisco, neighborhoods, the core, the financial district, the retail district. And a lot of the Victorians that we have today that have survived were just outside the fire zone in what we call the Western Addition, west of Van Ness Avenue. And after the earthquake and fire, that neighborhood became a neighborhood of different communities. The Japanese community, which had been displaced from another part of town, moved into the Western Addition, into those older Victorians that were not valued by a lot of people. And then, I seem to have lost my entire thing. There we go. And then during World War II, especially African Americans coming up here for the war effort, war workers, came to the Western Addition and had a very vibrant community that was built up around Fillmore Street. So this is the sort of setting for the core of what we had as Victorian architecture in the middle of the 20th century. It was a diverse community of people, buildings that were mostly rentals, split up into apartments, not valued as architecturally or for their value to the city. But like I said, lively communities, very vibrant. This is at Fillmore and, sorry, I'm losing my Sutter Street. And I just want to point out this building here because if you look down this scene, this building survives. We're going to see it a little later, but most of the rest of what you see is gone. And here's why. After World War II, urban renewal and redevelopment happened in many cities across the United States. The idea of we're going to take all this industry and this capital and all the stuff that had been happening during the war and put it to improving our cities. And I should point out that urban renewal was not about improving the lives of residents in these neighborhoods that were renewed. It was really about property values. And so this kind of makes it very clear. This is a graphic that was in the newspaper showing how the marina doesn't cost the city much money because it was a better off, newer neighborhood in health dollars. But over in the Western Addition, it did. So it was more about how does this neighborhood give money back to the city rather than how do we improve the lives of the residents in these neighborhoods, which might be overcrowded, have bad health outcomes, or have be impoverished in other ways. So here's a good example of how we started in San Francisco. We had this beautiful row of houses, flats, little stick Victorians, and this is where we got started in 1953. If these existed today along Jefferson Square, they would be very popular and sell for a lot of money. Other neighborhoods that have this Victorian architecture, these would be multi-million-dollar flats. But as you can see at the time, they were being torn down, and eventually the whole block was razed for public housing, which isn't a bad thing. But instead of trying to look at the housing and go, how do we adapt this and keep the people in place, it was like, we're starting fresh. And unfortunately, in the Western Addition, big swaths, like blocks and hundreds of buildings, hundreds of businesses, thousands of families were displaced as part of this urban renewal effort. This is Gough Street. We're not too far away from here now, looking west. And in its place, the whole idea was to turn this land over to developers to make good use of the land. So you get towers, cathedrals. There were nonprofits and church groups and unions that were able to build housing, which was good. But a lot of this wasn't affordable and was not for the people who lived there. So here is Project Area A1 in the Western Addition, where they got started. And then by the mid-60s, they decided we're going to make Project Area A2 and take up even more of this space for urban renewal. And this was at this point, people were pushing back. People in the neighborhood, people in the communities were like, we're not being taken care of here. You're not thinking about what you're displacing or what you're losing. And part of that was the architecture. People had started to appreciate Victorian architecture. And some of them were expressing it in very creative ways. We're getting kind of near the counterculture years. So there was a whole movement of homeowners called the colorists, who decided to bring these bright colors to these Victorians that had gone drab or a painted battleship gray during the war or covered with asbestos or stucco. And so it was an appreciation of Victorian architecture with a twist, and got quite fashionable. So in this environment, this is when San Francisco Heritage gets started. It was two gentlemen who said, you know, why doesn't San Francisco have an organization like they have in Savannah or some other place that is just an amazing jewel of an American city? Why don't we have that here? And of course, we're a newer city. It wasn't an idea. And people were only starting to appreciate the architectural merits of San Francisco. So it got started in 1971 to try to do something about that. And this little block along Van Ness Avenue and Turk was where we really got started. Today, this is what this looks like. It is early 1980s development, Opera Plaza with condominiums, a movie theater, and a bookstore, which is great. But this is, 1981 architecture. Back in the early 70s, it was full of 19th century flats and houses. Redevelopment agency had this block in its sights, and it was going to tear it all down and build what you saw, Opera Plaza. So this is how San Francisco Heritage is a little different. A lot of people, they're going to have placards, they're going to protest, they're going to march on City Hall, and we do that sometimes for sure. But we try to work with the city, we try to work with business, we try to work with developers and say, can we have a compromise here? Can we retain the historic resource and still get your project to pencil out? And so this is a good example. We worked with redevelopment and said, is there a place, this is El Malley, we're going to see that house being moved to. Is there a place in your whole project, you've been raising all these blocks, is there a place we can move these buildings and preserve them? And that's not normally what we want to do as preservationists. We want to keep it in place, the context of where it is, but sometimes we compromise. And so in August 1972, we arranged this with redevelopment. They put these buildings up for bid. You could have bought a Victorian for $100 in 1972. And Heritage was the bidder of last resort and ended up with 16 buildings. Here they all are. And the idea that we weren't going to hold all these buildings. We were a very small nonprofit. There was a couple of others in other places in the redevelopment project that were also slated to be moved or demolished. But we wanted to find a way to preserve them. And so we took it upon ourselves to take these on, work with redevelopment to find new locations, find new buyers, put easements on the buildings so they would not be imperiled in the future, and even help with financing so the new buyers would be able to afford their projects. So we had the big move in 1974. We won these buildings. We worked with redevelopment. We worked with the city, telephone companies, and moved all of these buildings, most of them over to a place we call Beidman Place. It's a little you'd think it was a little Victorian neighborhood that was always that way, but it was essentially a couple of blocks that were raised for redevelopment, and then some of the buildings were still there, and we moved others into place. So if you have time to go over there, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, some of them moved to a different place. We're going to go through these real quick.
What's the name of it?
Beideman, Beideman. Also, I have a little booklet about this whole story that you can take at the end and learn more about this. So here's a block of Turk Street and where these buildings ended up. This gets pretty specific because I gave this show to people who live in San Francisco and know all these addresses, but you don't have to pay too close of attention. But let's go through the dirty dozen, the ones we actually were successfully able to move. So you can see here is these two flats on Turk Street. We have to move in the night, early morning, when the traffic's not around. We have to take down power lines. So here is that house on the move going west. And I just want to point out this building. This also gets moved later. We're going to see it later. And it gets moved over to Eddy Street. This is our executive director at the time talking to the press. And people thought we were nuts. I just want you to tell you, this guy, this reporter, he is not saying, what a great job. They're going like, why would you want to save this piece of junk? It's funny to read the newspaper articles at the time. But that was what we were doing. So number 2, again, a fairly simple building, and it was in good shape where it was, and it looks pretty much exactly the same today. Also, there were a lot of VW bugs in the 1970s. All these pictures, I'm like, there's a VW bug in every photo I look at. So this was one of the nicer ones, 1868 building. We really loved this building, and again, the idea that you can just take a big, giant 2-story building, had this interesting side bay you see there in the back. And we had to be thoughtful about where they were placed too. So we put this one on a corner. It wasn't actually originally on a corner. It had a little side yard, but that way you could really see the side bay. Trees have grown up, unfortunately. It's kind of hard to see this one. 751 Turk is now over on Eddy and Divisadero. And then this was a very interesting building. It has these sort of 2 bays on the side and a 3rd bay. It's a little asymmetrical, very interesting. But again, making a very difficult right turn here, going west, and it's still there today on Scott Street. Volvos are also in a lot of 1970s photos. So we bought them originally, and then we immediately put out an ad that said, do you want a Victorian building? Here are all the things you have to do. Basically, you had to put up money, you had to have a guarantee, you had to work with redevelopment to make sure you weren't just buying it as a speculative thing to flip it. If you needed financing help, we help with that. And you had to understand that had to be a rehabilitation plan that was built in, so we knew they'd be fixed up and not, left this way interminably. I don't know, that's a little sketchy. And then the other thing is we put conservation easements on each of these, added them to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, so they'd be listed and they'd be protected. And we still hold the easements on these buildings today. So when somebody wants to do work and pull a permit, they have to contact us and clear it with us. And we're usually pretty accommodating, but we want to make sure the building is protected and preserved. Going uphill here to Broderick Street. And these two were in 2 different places, but in the end, they look like nice little sisters to go next to each other. So we did a lot of design thought in this, like these 2 flat front Italianates would look good together. The other thing I'd like to say, this one gets moved over to Bideman Place, this little alley. A lot of trees have been planted, and I like trees, but they do, if you like architecture, they do kind of, they're kind of problematic. They block the beautiful architecture. And this was kind of an outlier on Octavia Street. You can see in the background is what we call the washing machine, which is St. Mary's Cathedral. It looks like an agitator and a washing machine. That was part of the first wave of redevelopment. They basically tore down the whole block and they built that cathedral. So this is a little later. This gets moved in the night. There's a VW bug, and it is also 1970s red. I mean, you can totally see that. But I love the little details on the windows, the little eyebrows on each window, and that's what it looks like today. So we had these caravans of houses being moved. We got a lot of publicity for it. People, I had different reactions to it. There was a quote in the paper as it's moving down the street of a guy walking by and said, "Wow, instant ghetto." That's how they looked at these old beat up Victorians. But the shift was changing. I mean, the whole sort of idea of it was changing. This one, we only moved a block and a half. And unfortunately, it got pretty beat up before it got moved. We had a lot of problems with vandalism and, of course, all the things you can imagine. But we wanted to be responsive to the community. Most of the people who were displaced by redevelopment were African Americans. And so there was a big conversation at this time, like, are you just saving Victorians to gentrify the neighborhood, and or are you thinking about what this neighborhood is? So there were priorities for people who had been displaced to buy these houses and help for them. And these sort of have a shared party wall, even though they look like 2 buildings, were bought by a contractor named Willie Ballard, who was an African American in the neighborhood, and he fixed them up himself. chose this paint scheme. They're a little different today. And this was maybe the prize of the whole thing. This was the Newsom House, which had this great little tower parapet and this little sunburst detail. Just an amazing building, and it has a very funny story. It gets to Webster Street where it's supposed to go, and they realize it doesn't quite fit in that little spot. So they had to shave off a little part of the bay with a chainsaw and use 2x4s to wedge it in, but they got it in there. And this was our first logo because we were so proud of getting this building there today. There were a couple other smaller ones that moved just a couple of blocks, but it was just an amazing effort by women in fur coats who cared about architecture and these sort of roughneck house moving guys who just traveled itinerantly through the United States to make this project happen. The restoration took a few years in some cases, but we followed through with it. And it really led to other projects where people were moving Victorian houses, saving them to other parts of the city. Victorians became valued, they became trendy, and more thought about how to honor the African American community that was put into it. So a development called Victorian Square was about Black-owned businesses being able to move into Victorians that were moved to that corner of Sutter and Fillmore, where we saw that building in the first scene. They put the buildings around that corner, and it's still there today in a very vibrant little commercial corridor. Here it is today. That's the one in the corner, and that's the one I said we'll see later that got moved. It's kind of strange. It's definitely a corner building in the middle of the block. But I mean, really the triumph is Marcus Books, a Black-owned bookstore about Black history, moved into one of those buildings on Fillmore Street. Unfortunately, the African American community is still being displaced, mostly by economics at this point. So Marcus Books had to close a couple of years ago, even though they were a legacy business and everybody loved to have them there. So that's it. I think I'm about on my time, but thank you all for hearing the story. And please take a booklet when you leave.